Well, everybody, it's something I've thought a lot about, and I have come to the decision that this is going to be my last Goulet Q&A of 2024. I'm going to keep doing this, y'all, next year, but I am taking the next couple of weeks off, so enjoy this one because it's got to last you 3 weeks. What's up, friends? This is Goulet Q&A. This is episode number 293. I am Brian Goulet, and I'm skipping my whole intro today because y'all know it at this point. I don't have to keep saying the same stuff over and over again. And it's the end of the year, and I'm like, whatever. Bye, 2024. I'm ready for a new year to happen. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about some missing feedback. I'm going to talk about some new stuff, what blotter paper actually does, and if it affects the look of an ink, feed tuning, as opposed to nib tuning, wet versus dry inks, and how to differentiate them when you're looking at our website with a deep dive alert on ink properties. And then if it's safer to use iron gall inks in a gold nib versus a stainless steel nib pen with a deep dive alert on iron gall. My reaction when I get emailed or commented being called Brain instead of Brian, which happens all the time. And I'll be spotlighting the 3 new Pilot Iroshizuku inks that just arrived, Rika, Shungyo, and Toro. So I'm very excited about those. Let's kick it off with feedback. All right, so first bit of feedback, we have a very observant Burnham who said, at timestamp number 48 on the last video, was the feedback section cut out accidentally or accidentally not fully edited out? It starts and then it cuts off there. Don't tease me like this. Well, Burnham, you're very observant. You're like that friend that like points out when you have something in your teeth. You're like, thank you. It's a little bit awkward, but I don't want to be walking around with like broccoli in my teeth all day. Yeah, editing mistake. We had a section in there, we got like little cut-ups for like, they're title screens is what we call them. Totally just forgot to drop in the section in there that actually had the feedback. So I set it up and then moved right on. Didn't give you any feedback. So what the heck? Here's feedback from last week with Brian in a different shirt. All right, first one we have is from Chris Coffey. Says, as a default nib, the Sailor medium fine nib is the clear, perfect nib size in my opinion. I love the MF nib. Yes, I like that too. Japanese medium fines especially, this comes down to like what I was recommending as a good starter nib in the last episode. Japanese medium fines is pretty equivalent to a European fine. So I think you're right. You're right in the heart of it there, Chris. And yeah, that's actually my go-to for Sailor nib sizes as well, is that medium fine. It tends to be what I default to personally. This is from Not Leet. I feel like the default nib / grind is so personal. For work, I'm always doing extra fine or standard, but for journaling, I love broad or stub. I love a super wet nib with thick lines, but if I need other people to read it besides me, I really have to stick to finer nibs. I think this is a great example. Yes, it is super personal, and it can be quite a bit different depending on what need your writing is serving, and it can even change for you throughout the day. So this is part of where we all justify having so many pens in our collection is they have different uses, they have different, specificities to them. And yeah, it's just one of those hobbies that you can really nuance it quite a bit and personalize it quite a bit. So keeps it nice and vibrant, interesting, even after a decade and a half. And then we got one from Tony Devira that says, I love my TWSBI 580. It's my second fountain pen. First was a white Lamy Safari. And I often think about if it would be possible to just buy that ALR, the TWSBI 580 ALR grip, as a spare part to turn my 580 into an ALR. I've also daydreamed about figuring out how to make that grip section out of something like cork or wood. It would be so cool to figure out other ways to customize it in the future. Yeah, that would be cool. So there's no reason you couldn't sort of do that. But, the thing is, the 580, right? That one does have a grip section that you can buy, but it's just the clear like grip housing and nib. So it's like a spare nib unit basically, but it does come with the grip. But they don't sell like spare, 580 ALR grips or anything like that. So you can get a replacement nib, you can swap the parts. You could take the grip from a 580 ALR and put it on another 580, you just won't get a spare one to be able to do that. You got to get the whole pen. So, it's technically possible. And if you were going to make something for it, I mean, you would need something to be able to make it, a small lathe or something. But yeah, I mean, it's just like a tapered tube. So there's no reason you couldn't make something. I don't think cork would probably suffice on its own because it's relatively thin here and you're not going to really be able to get the substantive, whatever hardiness that you would need. I don't know. It's possible. I don't know. But I would think something like wood would probably do a little bit better on something a little sturdier there to hold up over time. But I mean, cork would be interesting. What the heck? You could try it. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of cool. Good feedback. Lots of people in the daydreaming about customizing the TWSBI. So that's kind of fun. All right, got some other feedback here. A lot of y'all commented about whether a couple means two or more or whatever. And while there was a lot of conversation and not particular unified agreement about what means like a few or several, that kind of wavered a bit. Y'all were all pretty firm about a couple meaning two. So I feel vindicated in that way. It's also extremely biased. It's okay. It's all lighthearted fun, but thank you for the feedback on that. It's always fun. And then we got one from Mitchell T, who says, I think maybe it's Michael. There's no A in there. Michael T, 007. Let's just go with it. I think it may be a good product if in collaboration with the manufacturer, Goulet Pens would offer its own collection of notebooks, kind of a paper exclusive, like a Clairefontaine with a grid or a notebook with pre-printed pages for ink swatching. And wink, wink, that would make a great Christmas gift to any pen enthusiast. Well, it's definitely not happening anytime soon. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, we do have some notebooks, but what I will say about going with something like Clairefontaine, like a major brand like that, especially if we're going with something custom on the paper, it's one thing if we do like a different cover color, or we just want to get something that's like a special order from, Europe that we can't get here in the US normally. But if we're going with something actually custom made, usually the prohibitive factor there is quantity. They need a minimum quantity with paper. It's not economical to do a small run of paper, especially if you're a large paper manufacturer. So typically it's a total non-starter. I mean, it's like the conversation is somewhere in the thousands or tens of thousands of notebooks of a single run, single color, single design, whatever. And we just, I appreciate if y'all think we're that big and successful, but we're nowhere near that. So it's never really been an option for us, but we'll think about it. Appreciate the ideas there. And then Eileen Goldenberg says, yes, Fude nibs are great for urban sketching, because I talked about the Fude last week with the Esterbrook with the Fude nib. And then MF says, yes, I frankenpenned an Ahab with a Jinhao Fude nib. So yeah, Jinhao I've seen some of those. Don't have any of those personally. We can technically order them from Jinhao, but again, it's a quantity thing, and the minimum quantities are pretty high, and I just don't know if that's a universally popular enough nib. I would love feedback on that if y'all really like Fude nibs. So yeah, let me know what you think. Anyway, that's it for feedback this week. Let's do some company updates. All right, first off, this is very recent news. I don't have a lot of details. I am not your authority on news, especially things not related to pens. But for those of y'all in Canada, apparently the Canada Post strike is over. They've worked through that, whatever. I don't know all the details, but I know that packages are starting to flow again, but there's a big backlog and it's going to take a while. So if you're placing an order through a non-like FedEx, option, just expect that there's going to be delays for a little while because they were on strike for several weeks during the holidays. So, yay, it's over, but also it's going to need a little time to get worked out. So that's happening. Also, I sort of teased you at the beginning here, but this will be the last Q&A of the year. Taking some time for my family for the holidays, and not going to be the end of videos though. So we're going to have hottest pens and hottest inks video coming at you. I've already filmed them, already made my selections. I feel good about them. So we'll have those videos publishing because I worked ahead, and I'll have those ready to go, and I don't have to do anything other than publish them. So that'll be fun. So yeah, look out for that. And then official close dates for Goulet pens. We're going to be closed Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. This is 24th and 25th, Tuesday and Wednesday next week. And then also January 1st, New Year's Day, which is a Wednesday. So we will be unavailable as a team on those dates, but we'll be working hard all around those dates to make it happen. All right, let's talk about a couple of new things. All right, first up from Retro 51. It's a rollerball, not a fountain pen, but that's okay. Retro gets an exception. We have an exclusive. This is a bourbon barrel Retro 51. This is really cool. It's made out of wood of my own heart. Started out making wood pens. How long ago was that now? 2007. Whatever that math is. It's going to be 2005. 18 years ago. Pfft, which is crazy. So a fully grown adult ago, that's what I was making pens out of, wood. So it's kind of cool to see some wooden pens that I didn't have to make. But these are made out of charred oak barrel staves from U.S. bourbon distilleries. So that's kind of cool. So anybody who's a bourbon fan, I mean, come on. This pen is really cool. $67, which honestly for a wood pen with the work that it takes to do that is pretty good. I never made them that affordable at the time that I made them. But either way, on sort of another end of the spectrum, we have the Montegrappa Goldfinger. So this is part of their 007. And they played with the numbers a little bit. They're making 707 of these Goldfinger pens. Kind of cool. Goldfinger, the movie, hits its 60th anniversary. So they're celebrating that. So it's kind of neat. It's a all gold pen. So I would say I can't really say it's like simpler or subtle because it's not. But it's not like this crazy looking thing that you like feels like it would be impossible to hold. It's an actually like usable functional pen. So it looks really nice. So check that out if you're interested, especially as a collector's item. $11.65 for that pen. So, and then we have the 3 new Pilot Iroshizuku inks, which is going to be the spotlight for today. So I won't go on about them too much, but they're the same price as all the other Iroshizukus, $23.73, which is a very specific amount. So we have 3 colors. We have Toro, which is Warm Lantern. So it's an orange yellow ink, like a marigold kind of a color, made after the color of an Andon lantern light in an alley after a rain. Very specific. But if you've ever experienced that, you'll be like, wow, they nailed it. And then we have Seung-yo, which is Spring Dawn. And that is a black with an essence, just an essence of red with a very, very slight green sheen. So it's meant to like embody like daybreak when it's like the darkness and then the sun just starts to come up and you get a little bit of that red. So it's kind of like a plum color a little bit. Looks really cool. And then Rika, which is Snow Crystal. So this is a blue, which is awesome. Almost kind of a turquoise blue. It's got a slight red sheen to it, which is awesome. There's a lot of good like Robert Oster colors kind of in this range, and I'm a big fan of them. So it's a heavy shader though. So it's a serene dance of snowflakes descending from a crisp winter sky is how they describe it. So they are very like poetic with these descriptions, which is awesome. I expect nothing less from Pilot. So that's some of the new stuff. The new things are slowing down a little bit because we're approaching the holidays. There's going to be probably a little bit of a dry spell here for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll hit the new year and then things will start rolling in again. So anyway, that's got to hold you over for the next 3 weeks. So let's do it. Let's get into the questions, shall we? All right. First question we have is from Mumalog. My question is, does blotter paper change the final appearance of the written product? So if you don't know what blotter paper is, this is a rocker blotter. We've carried this honestly for 15 years from like the very, very, very early on. Never been a huge seller for us. It's very old school, but essentially it's a very absorbent paper called blotter paper, and it is meant to soak up the excess ink that you might have on a page, especially for like signatures and stuff like that. Say you're a busy office tycoon signing deals left and right or whatever, and you're just signing signatures and you need to be flipping pages and signing things. You don't want your stuff smearing all over the place. So the idea is you sign your signature, you blot up the excess ink, you move on, you sign some more stuff, right? It's not really meant as like a whole notebook to be like blotting the whole thing, though you can buy blotter sheets in like larger sizes. Actually, what I like to do in my A5 size notebooks is I get a full size blotter sheet, which you can get, to cut down to fit your rocker blotter, but you get a full size sheet, just shove that thing in there, use it as a bookmark. That way, when you close your notebook, it's not transferring any ink onto the other side of the page. It's soaking it all up in the blotter paper. There you go. Big brain move on that one. So does it change the final appearance of the written product? Ideally, it shouldn't, not in a highly meaningful way. But it does depend on the paper. It depends on the ink. Depends on your technique when blotting it. Really, the biggest thing is if you're soaking up excess ink that might be on the page, you're going to have less shading, you know, because shading is like the difference between light and dark and how it looks on the ink. And if you are taking away the excess ink that would make it darker, just the degree of shading is going to be less. You could potentially smear it a little bit. I'm actually going to do a demonstration visually for you so you can see what I'm talking about. So a little less saturated color, a little more uniform color is going to be the biggest difference. Does that really matter for something like a signature? I don't know, probably not. The convenience might be worth it, but and then you know the other thing is if the blotting paper doesn't absorb the ink fast enough, you could smear or spread. So I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate that super quick for you, so you can see what I'm talking about. So I have here some rhodia paper, which is fairly ink resistant paper, but pretty good baseline here for, you know, somebody who might be using a fountain pen. I have a Pilot Custom 823 with the signature nib on it because it's a pretty wet nib, and would put down a decent amount of ink so that you could kind of more fully demonstrate what the whole blotter thing is all about. And of course I got my blotter here. So I will just go ahead and write. So this is a Pilot Custom 823 signature. So that, I'm just going to leave that right where it is so you can see what that looks like. And then here, I'm going to write the same thing again. Pilot Custom 823 signature. The ink I'm using here is Namiki Blue or Pilot Blue. It's actually Pilot Blue, but it's actually the same ink. It's just in a different bottle. And this one I'm going to blot. So I went a little too long on it. I wrote it too long. I have to go back and forth a couple of times. There you go. So I blotted it. Can you see a meaningful difference? I'll let you answer that question for yourself. It's not a huge difference. I mean, maybe a little bit. Maybe with certain inks it would matter a little bit more. I could see that being the case. But if you blot it professionally like I just did, then it shouldn't make a really meaningful difference. Not that this ink is like a super heavy shader, but it's a pretty good middle of the road ink. I'm going to do it again to demonstrate if you use pour technique, what it can look like when it smears, right? 823 signature. Sure. And then we're just going to be like, whoa. Ah! So technique matters a lot. So definitely if you have ink sitting on the page and you smear it with something, it's going to smear. Shocker, I know. Also, fun thing is, you know, you can see using blotter paper, you know, it's going to absorb ink. So if you're rapidly blotting stuff back and forth and you're blotting, you know, a pretty fresh, very wet signature, you can actually get some, whatever, imprinting or whatever you want to call it, of the ink that was on the blotter onto other parts that aren't even in the signature. So basically you want to take your time. But that's pretty much it. So pretty much it only makes a huge meaningful difference if you are sloppy. Otherwise, it should look pretty similar. All right, Marianne Hommel has a question that says, I hear a lot about tuning nibs, but is there anything that you can do to a feed besides replacing it? I have a pen that has a pretty inconsistent flow no matter what ink or paper I'm using. I've flossed it with brass and the tines look aligned. It's a Visconti Van Gogh. So it's gonna be a lot tougher to do something to the feed than it is doing it to the nib. Nibs are more malleable. They are made to be tuned and altered and stuff like that. Feeds are pretty precise, especially most modern feeds are made of plastic. They're not made of, hard rubber like would traditionally with much older pens. Hard rubber is a little more forgiving. You can heat it up. You can, bend it to fit the matching up against the feed a little better, against the nib. If you really needed to, you could like cut out and remove part of the ebonite feed to widen the ink channel if you wanted to. Technically, you can do some of that with plastic feeds, but it's a lot harder because the heat point on the melting point on these plastic feeds is going to be different than it is for the hard rubber. So and it will like deform. It's not as it's not like the hard rubber where you heat it up and then you can adjust it, and then it can just go right back, and it's not really a problem. It keeps its shape. Where plastic, if you do that, if you heat it up too much or you bend it the wrong way, you can just like ruin the whole thing. So, and then if you're trying to say widen the ink channel or something like that, I do know some people that have tried doing that with an X-Acto knife or something like that to like dig. But I mean, the ink channel is like really, really, really thin, and it's very, very difficult to do it in a precise and consistent way that will actually help your ink flow. Technically, it can be done. So it's totally up to you if you want to try doing that, but I probably wouldn't, because I wouldn't recommend pretty much most anybody do it, because it's very easy to screw up, and you can't typically get replacement feeds themselves for most pens. So, and if you go doing that, if you go digging something into your own feed, you're violating every warranty possible for the pen. So that's not gonna go great. You're taking your pen's life into your own hands, but it's also your pen. You can do whatever you want. I would not recommend that. I think though, probably part of the issue you might have is, it sounds like if the tines are aligned and if you flossed it, so there's not like a physical gunkiness happening in the nib, it could be, I don't know how you've used this pen previously or if you got it from somebody else, but if there is old ink or something like that in the feed channel itself, the nib itself may be fine, but if the ink flow going through the feed channel from the converter or the cartridge, if that is impeded in any way, that's going to give you flow issues. So thorough cleaning of the pen, I assume you're cleaning it. If you got a brass sheet, you probably know how to clean a pen. So forgive me if I'm speaking a little too basic here. I'm speaking more to just the general audience, maybe new fountain pen people who don't know what the heck we're talking about. So that is like step one. That's sort of like if you call up an IT service and they're like, is your computer plugged in? Is it turned on? When's the last time you restarted it? These types of things, they're like super basic questions, but it fixes most issues. So typically when there's flow issues, it's like, when's the last time you thoroughly cleaned your pen? Because some people are like, yeah, I thoroughly cleaned it. I held that nib under the faucet for like 3 minutes. And it's like, well, that didn't do anything for the feed. You got to like flush the thing out, and ideally flush it with some sort of like dish soap or some sort of detergent or a pen flush, something like that, if you're having flow issues. But if you've had this pen for a while, it's always had flow issues, and you feel like it should write wetter, it might be that the tines are pinched too close together. That can definitely happen. Not super, super unusual for some brands to do that. I haven't heard that happening a lot with Van Goghs, but it wouldn't totally shock me. So it could be smooth. It could write perfectly fine alignment-wise, but if the tines are pinched too close together, it's going to impede that flow a little bit, unless you're using a little bit of writing pressure on it. So you could write with a little bit of pressure, or, if you're willing to go risky here, you can overflex the nib a little bit so that it kind of spreads the tines as if you're writing with a flex nib. But if you're doing that with a steel nib like that, if you do it a little bit to sort of intentionally spring the tines just a little bit to open that back up, that could help. I typically don't recommend doing it on pens in this price range, so your mileage will vary. I do not hold harmless heretofore, henceforth legal disclaimer. I'm not giving advice here. I'm telling you things I've done and things I've tried, and you make your own decisions. But, that is an option. But if you're not comfortable doing that and you're like, it shouldn't be this way, first off, reach out to your retailer. If you got it from us, reach out to us. But typically with any retailer that you get through, there's going to be like a kind of a warranty period or a return period or something like that. If you're past that, you could still reach out to Visconti or the distributor for Visconti, wherever you're located, and see what they can do about it, especially if it's been a pervasive issue and it's just like, can't do anything. They might be able to do it. Or honestly, it's something like this is a pretty simple fix for a Nib Pro. It might behoove you just to, if you really want to make the pen work and you're frustrated, can't work, you could send it to a Nib Pro and they could widen that thing. They could open up the nib safely, and then you have a great writing pen. So that's probably more the route that I would go. I don't think that this is probably a feed issue. Not that there can't be feed issues, But typically when they're doing these plastic feeds or kind of injection molded or whatever, I mean, that's where it can be helpful to reach out, especially if it's had issues like from day one and the nib seems perfectly fine. Working on like a warranty kind of standpoint, I know it's always annoying and that you shouldn't have to do that ideally, but stuff happens. If there was any kind of a defect with the feed, obviously the manufacturer would need to deal with that. And so that would be the hope. But yeah, there's really not a lot of good options for spare feeds or working on feeds or anything like that. That is just kind of the nature of modern pens. They're just not very user workable, those feeds. Yeah, so that's the advice I got for you. So hopefully that helps, but we got plenty other deep dives to go on. So I'm going to move on to some other questions, okay? All right, Lynn Phelps has a question here, setting me up for a deep dive. Didn't realize that that's what would happen, but I found myself down in the deep dark cave. Lynn asks, I don't understand wet versus dry inks. I looked on the website, but it's not one of the attributes that you can filter. As a novice, how do you know which inks are wet or dry? This is a complicated question. It should seem simple. And I totally feel you because honestly, I'm still kind of learning about this, even after 15 years. So don't feel bad that you don't know what's going on. So you're correct. This is a really tough thing to describe consistently because there's many factors and we do not have a filter on our website because of said factors. So the TLDR, if you don't feel like listening to the whole answer to this question, is hashtag it's complicated, and wet and dry don't necessarily mean one specific thing. People could be talking about any number of different properties that can all be described as wet or dry, which may or may not have some wet and some dry mixed in there. So it's not as straightforward as a thing to classify ink as it may seem. So that said, let's get into it in more detail, okay? So let's talk about what can influence an ink to write wetter or drier. So if you're talking novice level here, I will explain a little bit of what makes up fountain pen ink, okay? It's mostly water. That's the base. So that's the solvent. So you need something to dissolve all the other stuff into. That is distilled water, water with as little impurities in it as possible. That's the basis for modern fountain pen ink. At least the vast majority of inks, especially ones you should use in a fountain pen. Anyway, so the things that can then be impacted in terms of flow. I'm going to improvise here. I made all these notes, but I'm just going to explain the different components of ink. You have your water, you have your dye. It can either be like a dye, like that dissolves, or it can be a pigment that's, little bits of stuff that kind of float around in there. Those are going to be your colorants. And then you need some kind of either like a flow agent or, detergents or glycerin or something, or glycerol, something like that. That's going to be like a lubricant that can help, that won't affect the way that the ink behaves. Usually some kind of salt is in there as well. And to help everything, I don't know exactly what the salt does, but it does something to help everything mix together or something, I don't know, or keep things in suspension maybe. And then there's usually some kind of biocide in there as well to keep stuff from growing in it because you want it to last a long time. Those are the main components. Did I get everything? It's like 5 main components: water, dye, detergents. No, I'm missing something. Oh, and then some sort of a thickening agent like a gum arabic or something like that helps everything kind of stay in suspension. That's what it is. So there's all these different components. There could be other things in there too. We don't really know because there's no MSDS sheets for this ink. There's no advertisement pretty much from any manufacturer as to what is actually like the specific components that make up this ink. But this in general are the different components of ink, right? So when it comes to flow, how wet or dry an ink is, you're talking about a couple of different properties that can impact this, right? One is viscosity. So that's the thickness of the ink. The higher the viscosity, the thicker it is, the slower it's going to move through the pen. Lower viscosity is going to be thinner, runnier. It's going to absorb quicker into the paper, so on and so forth. So generally speaking, the thicker the ink, the higher the viscosity, the drier it's going to feel, so it's not going to be moving along as easily, So it's sort of like if you're trying to pour maple syrup out of a bottle. It's not going to pour nearly as quickly as if you just take a cup of water and you just kind of dump it, right? So that's the kind of thing. Not that fountain pen ink is going to be as thick as maple syrup, but that's an extreme example. The surface tension, that can make a difference. So how clingy it is, the molecules to themselves, also clinging to like the physical stuff, like the sides of the pen, the feed, the stuff like that, the paper. That surface tension can be a different factor than the viscosity, and also can affect how quickly an ink is going to move along. The saturation of the dyes or the pigments, the colorants that are in there, the more stuff that you put in there, generally the more you're going to increase your viscosity. But basically, if you have a lot of colorants, if you have a lot of dyes, whatever, generally, all else equal, it's going to write drier. So a more saturated ink will typically write drier. Asterisk that, we'll come back to it. It's actually not the case with most inks, but there's other reasons for that, which, segueing to my next point, you have additives, other things like lubricants and detergents. So either like some kind of glycerol or propylene glycol, sorbitol, something like that. That can have a number of effects on different things, but basically it is meant to act as a lubricant to help things flow along. So if you are trying to increase the flow, you add these things in there. So typically what happens with a lot of manufacturers is if they're doing a really saturated ink color, there's a lot of dye and stuff like that that will impede the flow, generally speaking, they will then add these surfactants in there to help move things along. And depending on how much of the lubricants that they add in there can drastically affect how wet or dry an ink is. So you see how there's all these different things, these different components that go into it. Well, any of these can change the game, and it's not consistent from one brand to another. It's not consistent from one line within a brand. It's not consistent to one category or class of colors. It's not even, from one ink to the next within a single brand with a single color. They can behave differently because there's different dye components, there's different formulations, and the properties can be different from one ink to another. So if you're a novice coming into it, you're like, what in the world? This is like trying to pick a bottle of wine, and you're like, I don't know what makes any of these different from the other than like the label, the name, and the price. I get it. It's really complicated. A lot of it you may not even notice as more of a novice, but when you use fountain pens more and more, you notice more things like flow and dry time and stuff like that, that might impact how much you enjoy an ink, completely apart from its color and its, water resistance properties and stuff like that. It really depends. And it's very different for every person depending on what they need. And on top of that, all these things are also impacted by the design of the feed inside a given pen, the nib size that you might have and how generous that flow is. If you write with a heavy hand versus a light hand, the writing angle that you use, the paper, the absorbency of the paper, your writing speed, all of these things can affect how wet or dry an ink will feel. It's really a lot. It's really complicated. So what gets really confusing is that a number of these different components that make up an ink formulation can all affect things like viscosity, surface tension, and so on. Moisture retention, that's another thing. So like the ink staying wet when it's on a nib when you're not writing it, that's another factor. So really the complication is that a lot of these components come together. We as users of these things, there's no set measurements or set rules as to what is wet, what is dry. It's all based on our perception and what we think and feel. Even you go and look at people's ink reviews and they're trying to be very consistent and very, definitive with their classifications of things like flow. It's all subjective. It's all just, it can be subjective with consistency. It can be one person reviewing everything and they're using the same pen, the same ink paper and all that. So they can try to eliminate as many variables as they can, but even still, it's still subjective to the person using it. So it doesn't mean that you're going to have that same opinion or that it's going to perform the same for you. All this stuff kind of comes into play. So it does get kind of confusing in terms of how you classify these things. Now there are, it's physics, it's physics and chemistry here. There are real properties that we could classify and say, this is wet, this is dry, yada, yada, yada. But you would need to have rigorous testing, a lot of consistency, very expensive scientific measurement equipment to measure things like viscosity and surface tension. I don't know anyone on the ink manufacturing side of things that is doing that. You would probably need like an independent lab to do that type of stuff, because the level of rigor and science that would be required for that is probably beyond what most people in the pen, manufacturing situation are set up for. And also it's like you would get a bunch of random numbers of things like surface tension, all that. You're like, so what does that actually mean? Is this ink going to feel wet or dry? I don't know. I don't even know if we went through and measured all of those different components. We might come back with like 10 different numerical measurements, probably in units that we don't even understand, because I've looked into things like surface tension before, and it gets into science and gets into units of measurement that I'm not familiar with, which is not helpful. Maybe it's been too long since I've been in school. But anyway, so it is ultimately a subjective thing. Is your experience, does an ink feel wet or dry? And then what gets further complicated, I feel like I'm just justifying why we don't have the classification on our website, but I've thought about this for 15 years, right? It's just super complicated. The other complication to it is there are different experiences that we might have with an ink, some of which will feel more like a wet ink. So how quickly does it flow out of the paper? Does it make the nib feel like it's writing smoother, or does it feel like there's more drag on the page, right? So if you have a highly lubricated ink, it may actually lubricate the nib a little bit on the page, and that may feel wetter, right? But if it's a really saturated color and it's not absorbing into the paper as quickly, the dry time might be longer, and you'd be like, oh, this is, whatever, really dry. I mean, it's very subjective, and there can be different properties. If you have a really saturated color that like is lubricating the nib, and you're like, oh, this feels really wet, but then it might dry quicker on the nib, and you'd be like, oh, this is a really dry thing, or it may have a harder time starting. You're like, well, this feels really dry, but then when it gets going, oh, it feels really wet, and it might depend on the paper. And it's like, there can be all these different properties that all interplay and change maybe with each other from ink to ink, depending on things like the additives and how much dye and on all these things. So all this to say, it's complicated. Hashtag it's complicated. So we actually used to have more detailed like product reviews on our site. When we built out our new site back in 2018, I don't remember if we had this portion of the reviews even before that, but I know we did that way back then. We had like dry time, flow, things like that as like qualifiers for our ink reviews for the ink products on our site. Well, it worked out okay for the ones where people reviewed it a lot, but there were a couple of different issues that we had. One is that it wasn't being done consistently over a lot of inks. There's kind of a long tail. There's like, if you've ever heard the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, 80% of people are going to be using 20% of the inks out there. So you got a really popular set of inks that a lot of people are going to review and be familiar with. And you got this like super long tail of the other 80%, which you're like, I have no information on this. I can't really, nobody else has really used this ink. It's hard to tell. That's normal. That's a normal distribution with most things, honestly. But it's definitely the case. So, those reviews were kind of helpful for the 20%, right? The really popular stuff. But what ended up happening was having like wet, dry, and it was like a sliding scale. We had it in there. It ended up being like kind of a standard distribution of like a bell curve where like 80% of all the inks were just kind of indistinguishably in the middle. It was like, it's kind of middle flow, medium flow. Even us doing our ink reviews, trying to do it, it's like, it kind of feels like most other inks. It's like, it's really hard for us with subjectivity, especially when combining like feel and visual at the same time. It's really difficult for us to distinguish distinct gradients, right? Like we can pretty much only tell the extremes. So that's what ended up happening is we had, inks that felt really wet, inks that felt really dry. Those were kind of okay. Like you could kind of get something from that. But most everything else, it kind of fell in the middle somewhere. And honestly, that's probably going to be most people's experience. You're only going to really be impacted by extremely wet or extremely dry inks. So it's not necessarily as helpful of a thing to define as you may think, because there can be so many factors. Now, in a perfect world, it would be great because you'd be like, oh, this pen writes a little wet. Let me use a drier ink. I really like how this feels. Now, probably what's going to happen is at some point you're going to put an ink in that pen that will have some of the components in it that will make it feel drier in the right way that you like it. And you'll be like, wow, this pen pairs really nicely with this ink. And I like that. Somebody else may write with it and have a totally different experience, but you may like that. There's really not a good way for us to like put something up on the website, filterable or whatever, that's going to help you to be able to find that, which stinks because I understand with 800 plus inks, there's like this ocean of information to have to sort through. And you're like, this is impossible. I'm just having to get ink samples and try all this different stuff. It's taking forever. But you're in good company because this is what all of us who are deep in the fountain pen experience, you know, if you're going for like a very, very specific feel, it can be maddening. But also, like, I can say from my own experience, at least, of having done this for such a long time, I kind of like the adventure of it. And I kind of like that when I ink up a different pen with a different ink, I might get a slightly different experience than what I predicted. And I learned to kind of roll with that a little bit, as long as it writes, you know, properly, right? But I kind of roll with it and don't try to overanalyze it too much. Part of that is like, I'm just using so many pens and inks. I don't have time to overanalyze it necessarily. But anyway, so that's the difficulty with defining flow. But I got a question. I'll kind of pose this out there because I don't want to feel like I'm copping out right here. You know, so it's like we've done a lot of things on our website over the years to try to really make things easier for you all to see. A lot of technical specs, a lot of measurements, the Nib Nook, the Pen Plaza, Swab Shop, all these things that we've done over the years. So I'm not afraid of doing something that's a little more difficult if it's really going to be helpful. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions. So y'all give me some feedback. Should we come up, we Goulet pens, should we come up with a more like objective definition and declare which inks are wet and which inks are dry, or maybe something in the middle? Is that something that you want? And would you be okay with that being still somewhat subjective? I would like to know that, for one. Should we try to be more scientific about it? Maybe measure certain properties if we can. I make no promises on that because it sounds complicated, but things like viscosity or surface tension or whatever, I don't know, lubrication, I don't even know how to measure that. But is that something that would be helpful? And if you're a scientist and you know this kind of stuff, let me know how practical this would be, because I would really appreciate that. I get the sense it wouldn't be very practical with 800 inks. Should we test them, just write with them all ourselves, right? We do that with ink reviews and stuff like that, which maybe can be helpful. Should we test them ourselves and then make some kind of like subjective determination? Yeah, it's still going to be in the bell curve. It's going to be like, well, everything's kind of medium, except this is really extreme one way or the other. Maybe that would be a helpful distinction even. Should we maybe open it up, kind of like we used to do with the reviews, maybe open it up to the community and try and get a lot of feedback? That's going to be tough with so many different inks, because I feel like we're going to get, you know, more opinions about some of the more popular inks. But I don't know. Could be interesting. Kick up the conversation. I'm genuinely curious about all these questions. So let me know what you think. Yeah, we'll see where that goes. But in the long history of fountain pens, there really hasn't been anything super, super scientific about how the ink works. And I get the sense that even if it was, it probably wouldn't make the most meaningful difference to your experience other than inking up an ink in a pen and writing with it. So there you go. That's all I got for that one. You're welcome. Deep dive. All right, next up. I really didn't plan this out. Doing 2 deep dives back to back, but here we are. This is from Kirby Nix, who says, Iron Gall ink, better for gold nibs or steel nibs? Specifically, platinum citrus black. Okay. Well, I don't have like the most specific information about citrus black as a color. Because again, I just talked about ink formulations. I don't really know, other than knowing that it's iron gall. I don't know how citrus black is formulated any more than any other platinum, platinum classic ink, right? The iron gall ones. So let's talk about iron gall, shall we? If you're new to the world of fountain pens, you might hear iron gall and you'd be like, what the heck is that? So iron gall, Gall is gall. It is an ink that is very, very old. So a little bit of history here. If you want to get some research on this, I'm pulling some of this, information from a very good article that I found from the American Philosophical Society. And I think we'll link to that maybe in the video description. It talks about, okay, what is iron gall? What is all this stuff? So traditional iron gall is made from 4 main components. So typically this was like dip pens and stuff like that. I mean, this goes back to like the 4th century. Like there's stuff, really old parchment that has examples of iron gall ink on it. It's very different formulated than iron gall inks today, and I'll get to that in a minute. So it's made from oak galls. So a gall, they're sometimes called oak gall nuts. So they're, these big balls. They're not actually a nut, like oak have acorns, right? But the galls, what that actually is when insects come and lay their eggs underneath the bark, it's kind of like a reaction that the tree has, it's like an immune system almost. It will encase the larvae in these like protective balls. And a lot of times they'll chew through it and they'll get out, but you end up with these little balls like this, and the ones that have traditionally been the most prized were the ones where like the bugs were kind of still inside there because it would like darken it up and make the color richer and stuff like that. So anyway, they pick these things out. They grind them up, right? So they grind them up and that's going to be the base for the ink. So that's why it's called gall. So it's the tannins from the galls. So trees, have tannins in them, especially oak. That's what, if you're talking about like wine and bourbon, whiskey, stuff like that, it's the tannins in the wood that help to age it and give it its flavor and stuff like that. So similarly, these oak galls, they are helping to make the ink richer, and it's the properties of the tannins that it's reacting with. So that's going to be basically the base of the ink. And then you need some kind of solvent to dissolve it into, right? Traditionally, it would be some kind of fermented product like a beer or a wine, and you would soak the galls in this beer or wine. Now you're like, well, that sounds kind of disgusting. And it is. Traditional iron gall ink is disgusting. So you would soak this stuff in like a fermented whatever until it starts to mold, basically. And that reaction is what is actually going to produce the gallic acid that is needed to help produce this ink. So once you get that gallic acid produced, then what happens is you are adding in ferrous sulfate. Okay, so that's a chemical that or I guess it's like a powder, whatever it is. I don't know. I did okay in chemistry. It's not my gift. It was a long time ago. Anyway, you add ferrous sulfate to the gallic acid. It's going to dissolve in that acid, and it's going to make this blue-black like iron tannin that's in there. And it's the iron that's in there that is going to react to oxygen. It's going to oxidate once it's written down on the page. So traditionally, if you've ever heard of blue-black ink, that term comes from iron gall ink because the iron that was in the iron gall that comes from the ferrous sulfate that reacts with gallic acid, all that kind of stuff, when you put it down on the page, it oxidizes, when it's exposed to air and the paper and moisture and all that kind of stuff. And it would darken over a series of, maybe a week or so to its like permanent darkened state. So it would go down like a lighter blue, but then it would darken up to a black. So it's called blue-black. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Nowadays, it just means like a navy blue. But a traditional blue-black ink would actually color shift like that because of the iron that was oxidizing in the ink. Now, just to continue on with what's going on here, you also have gum arabic, just like when I talked about in the last question. That is going to increase the viscosity, help that keep that pigment in suspension. It helps it bond to the paper as well. Traditionally, the iron gall ink would be used. It would be very thick, and you would use it for quills or for dip pens, which a thicker ink is more ideal in those kind of applications. Because if you use a traditionally like if you didn't have a feed and you just had a dip nib and you just dip it right into fountain pen ink, it's going to be just like, it's all kind of going to run off, right? Unless the nib is kind of designed specifically to be used that way. But you're going to be dealing with, a thicker ink with traditional iron gall. So the reason we're talking about this whole question here, it's all a setup because we're talking about safe for different nibs, right? The reason it would not be safe in particular is because it would be very acidic. This ink would be very acidic. It would be somewhere in the pH between 1 and 3, which is pretty dang acidic, like kind of like battery acid almost. It's pretty darn acidic. If you've ever used modern fountain pen iron gall ink, don't think that it's like touching battery acid because it's not formulated that way. Traditional iron gall ink is kind of some nasty stuff. And what they actually found is that documents and stuff like that from much older, some of them, depending on how the stuff was all made up, because it wasn't necessarily like uniform and scientific, depending on how this iron gall ink was made, could be very acidic. It actually degrades and eats away the paper over time. So a lot of old documents and stuff, you'll actually see the writing and it's like, the writing is almost not there anymore because the ink itself ate away the paper over time. So they've learned that iron gall is like, maybe not. I mean, it's very permanent until it destroys whatever it's written on, right? So I don't know, what good is that? So the reason that it's so acidic by the time you go to write with it is because of the excess iron sulfate that is like the byproduct of, creating this ink. It's the excess stuff, which is going to corrode not only the paper, but it's going to corrode metal. It's going to corrode nibs, right? So let's talk about modern iron gall ink, right? So I've talked about traditional iron gall ink, some crazy stuff. You can actually make it yourself even. But that's a whole other thing. I've never done that. I don't plan to. It sounds gross. Modern iron gall ink is got some of similar properties, but it is made in a much more controlled manner. So they're going to be using much lower amounts of iron sulfate. It's going to be much more controlled, so there's not as much excess left over, thus keeping it from being so acidic. They're also going to use more refined tannic acid sources, not as many impurities. They're going to be looking to optimize the reaction that happens with the iron gall between the gallic acid and the tannins and stuff like that. And it's going to have a more optimized reaction so it doesn't have excess acidity in there. They're also going to be using pH stabilizers, right? So they're going to bring the pH up to something like borax or something with a higher pH, help to neutralize and bring that acidity up to a more neutral position. Make it less acidic, make it less corrosive. And they may have other additives in there that may be, stuff that will help to inhibit corrosion, might protect whatever metals that it's coming into contact with, and all kinds of modern sciencey, chemically things, right, that might help with that. So while modern iron gall inks, like the Platinum Classic inks, are iron gall, and there's other iron gall inks too, Twisby Blue Black being one that might be more of a surprise, I believe. When you're talking about where'd I go? Like the risk of it being corrosive, it's really not as much of a concern today with modern fountain pen formulated iron gall inks. It's much more of a holdover from calligraphy, the world of calligraphy, for two reasons. One is you're using that more traditional ink. Sometimes there's modern versions of that ink too, but some people, if you're writing with a calligraphy with dip pen, you're not exactly like on the bleeding edge. Not to say that you're a total Luddite, but like you're doing it to intentionally do something the way that it's not done anymore, to go kind of back in time. So it kind of makes sense, just like if you're a photographer and you want to go back, you're going to shoot on film to get the full experience, right? So you may go back and use the kind of weirdo homemade, I shouldn't say weirdo, it sounds so judgy. Everybody worked with what they had, right? But the traditional kind of make it in your kitchen kind of a iron gall ink, which is going to be very corrosive and not very controlled in terms of its formulation. If you're using that kind of stuff, it's going to be a lot more corrosive. It's not going to flow well in a fountain pen for sure, but even if you did put it in there, say it was like the viscosity was correct to actually be able to flow, it's going to be very acidic and is going to degrade probably several components of the pen, but particularly the metal. So now we get into but modern fountain pen inks are not formulated to be nearly as corrosive as those. So it's something to be aware of, but not something to be like afraid of. So pretty much when it comes to using these modern iron gall inks like the platinum ones, you basically just kind of use them like regular ink. I would maybe take some precaution, especially if you're using particular vintage pens, things that are either harder to work on or irreplaceable and stuff like that. Maybe you don't know what kind of materials the pen's made of. I would maybe just not use any type of permanent ink or anything complicated in there, just to be safe. But, surprisingly enough, there's actually quite a few just regular fountain pen inks that are also quite acidic. That's neither here nor there. We could get into measuring pH of inks, and that's a whole other beast. And it's kind of like the flow thing that we just talked about. Measuring pH of inks, you're like, okay, that's the pH. What does that mean to me now? What do I do with that information? I don't know. You'd be surprised. Like some inks, it's all over the place in terms of pH. There's like things I've seen on Fountain Pen Network and other people that are like more like scientists by trade, and they've like measured it with some of their equipment and stuff like that. And some of the inks are like, it's all over the place. Some are like really neutral. Others are like pH of 3, and it's just like, whoa, these vary a lot. And just like conventional inks, I don't know. It's all over the place and it's all proprietary kind of stuff. So we don't really know. Let's see here. Going back to your original question, which boy, have I taken a while to get there, right? You have your iron gall, whatever degree of corrosion you have. You have gold nibs versus stainless steel nibs. Now, which is more corrosion resistant? Well, technically gold is more corrosion resistant in its pure form. However, 14 karat, 18 karat gold it's not pure 24 karat gold. So there are going to be other things in there that's not gold. So you're going to have things like silver and copper and other things that do corrode. Those are going to be more problematic. So I believe that stainless steel, because of the properties that it has and the various things like nickel and stuff like that are in there, maybe some chromium, I'm not sure. They're going to be corrosion resistant. So you could argue that modern stainless steel nibs are actually more corrosion resistant than gold nibs. Have I actually seen that make a difference in terms of people using iron gall inks in their pens? I'm not going to say that it can't make a difference, but I've never seen any definitive thing with modern iron gall ink saying like, oh my gosh, it negatively impacted this pen, that pen, whatever. I've never seen that with any pen, really. I don't know if it's just that iron gall inks are not all that popular, or maybe people that get into them, they're using the ink, but then when they're not writing with the iron gall ink, they remove it out of the pen and then write with other inks, and it's just not being exposed to iron gall ink, for years and years and years. That could be the case too. So just a couple things I would say. You probably don't need to worry a whole lot about whether you're using a gold or steel nib. I would imagine, especially if it's like an 18 karat gold, that's going to be more gold, more corrosion resistant. I probably wouldn't sweat it too much, other than if it's a gold nib pen, it's rare or expensive or whatever, and you just don't want to risk it. Maybe that's a reason to use stainless steel instead. But honestly, I think you can pretty much use any of these modern inks and not sweat it too much. I would just say, don't use it in the pen and then leave it in there like I do with most of my pens. Just leave the ink sitting there in the pen for who knows how long, because you're just exposing that pen to more of the potential acidity and stuff like that in there that it's not really doing anything for you. It's just kind of sitting there. So just clean the pen out if you're going to not use it for a while. Or maybe switch between iron gall and other inks. And that's just like from a practical standpoint, what I know a lot of people do. And again, I've never heard of any major concerns. So I wouldn't really lose a lot of sleep over it. I did find an article. I was just doing a little Googling. No affiliation here, but Laura over at Fountain Pen Follies had an article from 2017, talked about her experience using Platinum Classic ink in her steel nib pen. I think it was a Pilot Plumix. No negative effects whatsoever. So, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't really lose a lot of sleep, but if you like nerding out on some stuff, hopefully you learned something here. And now I'm going to do the opposite of a deep dive with this next question. All right. This next question comes from man of my own heart, Brian Middleton with an I. Brian. Does anyone ever call you Brain in an email, even though your name is like right there? Right there is written in all caps. This is clearly spoken from years of pain, Brian's experience. So we have Brian K here at our office. I know a lot of various Brians. There's a lot of Brians in the fountain pen world. Some with a Y, most with an I. Which one is right? Who's to say? Me. It's an I. The I is right. The Y is just wrong. I'm kidding. Very much kidding. It really depends on where you're from. But anyway, whatever. The Y Brians, though, don't have to deal with this particular issue because they're not getting auto-corrected to say brain, or just people mixing it up. It happens all the time. Honestly, it happens so much that I don't even really notice it a lot of times anymore. I might notice it every now and then. But I also will type it wrong myself sometimes. The tough thing about that is autocorrect doesn't catch it if you spell it wrong. Or autocorrect will correct it for you if you're just typing out your name. I'm sure y'all have that sometimes. Some of you have, names. If it's too close to like a non-name word, sometimes autocorrect will just be like, no, I think you meant brain. I think you meant whatever. Something else. Janaea here on our team says her name gets autocorrected to James all the time. So you kind of just learn to roll with it. I don't really sweat it. What's funnier though is my last name. When it gets mistyped or autocorrected. I've had two of the funniest ones have been Goulet getting changed to Goblet. So brain goblet gets pretty interesting. Or the even funnier one, Goulet gets corrected to toilet. So yes, brain toilet is what autocorrect sometimes thinks that my name should be. So, we all have our thorn in our side. We all have our burdens to bear. And this is just the life of a Brian with an I, is you're going to get called brain. But there's worse things, like brains are good, right? So I don't know. I just take it as a compliment. Like, sure, brain. Anyway, silly question, silly answer. But I see you, Brian. I'm with you, man. Let's do a spotlight on the Pilot Iroshizuku 3 new colors. All right, we have 3 Pilot Iroshizuku colors here. Now these are brand new, just came out at the end of 2024. And the thing that I like about Pilot is they don't come out with a lot of colors, but when they do, you know you're going to get something good because they are very high quality and the inks have a really good reputation. So I didn't quite know what to expect in terms of like the properties of the ink and stuff like that, but I knew that they were going to be good, and they are. Presentation is amazing. I love the packaging. Of course, every bottle is unique with the color on the label and the box and everything. It's just awesome. I'm a Pilot fan, in case you couldn't tell. Let's take a look at the ink on paper. Now, I have to have a little disclaimer here. These are on Tomoe River paper, which is going to be maybe not the best indicator of all papers that you might use. These assets were created by our lovely Brian K here on our team. So thank you, Brian. So you're getting some, maybe more shading, maybe a little bit more sheen than you would on conventional paper. But I also grabbed the swabs that we use. This is on in the swab shop. If you're ever wondering, like, this is the thing. So this is going to be a little bit lighter color, not as much shading, not as much color variation, which is pretty normal. So you can definitely see some of the shading here, like especially up in the writing. So that is going to be, pretty normal and expected. But it's not going to be like this crazy stuff unless you're dumping the ink on Tomoe like we did here. But anyway, so all around nice color. I would say this like marigold color, it really, to me, kind of flirts with, usability and read back. If it gets too yellow and too light, then it can look interesting. But when you're trying to look at a whole page of writing, especially the finer the nib size you go, it becomes like, what am I even looking at here? I can't distinguish these letters from the paper. I think this one's okay though. I haven't written with a full page with it yet, but I think I would be okay with this one. But if you like inks in this color range, I think this one will be a very nice one. This ink I really like though. Shungyo. So this is, you know, they tout it as like a black. So it's like basically meant to be, you know, dawn, where you have mostly black and then the sun is starting to come up and you see a little bit of red starting to peek through. And so you have this red cast kind of amongst the black. So anytime you mix red and black together, you get, you know, kind of a plum, like a dark purple color. And that's exactly what you have here. Now, I wasn't expecting this kind of like green sheen to come out. Now, granted, this is on Tomoe. It's kind of extreme case, but, you know, it is, the potential is there, you know, for it to do that, if that's what you're looking for. But if you're like, that green looks disgusting, I hate that, I don't ever want to see that, don't worry about it. You're probably not going to see it too much with your conventional paper. This is our swab of that. So you do still see some shading and you do still see a little bit of color variation, but overall you're getting just a very, very nice, dark kind of plum purple color. This is what I would call like a work safe ink. Like this would be really good if you just don't want to look at black ink all day, but you didn't want something that was going to like stick out like a sore thumb. This would be a fun ink to use. I think that it would be really, really good for that purpose. I imagine this will be a good alternative for a lot of people just using plain black ink. And then we have Rika. Rika's awesome. It's my favorite because it's blue. It's got a little bit of red sheen. I mean, if you know me, this is like exactly the kind of color range that I like to play in. I think it kind of flirts with turquoise. You know, it's not quite as like light blue as I think turquoise typically is, but it's kind of walking that line, right? Yeah, and on Tomoe especially, you get more of that red sheen that kind of pops out. Honestly, the color looks different on my phone as I'm looking in the screen than it does in real life. Any blue in this color range is so hard to get color accurate in digital form. Our photographer does a great job. I feel pretty confident about that, but in person, it's going to look better. Comparing it to the swab, so don't have as much of that kind of red sheen, though there is a tiny bit of it up here. So depending on which paper you're using, depending on how much you dump that ink on there, you might see a little bit of that, but you do see some pretty good shading. Like you can't see it a ton here because it's written in print and that doesn't show it quite as much. But you can definitely see some shading happening. Sorry, if I zoom in more, it's like just doesn't autofocus. Doesn't like to do that. I don't know what's up with my phone. Yeah. So anyway, you got some shading there. You know, that's really about it. I did ink up some pens, which now I'm realizing I talked so long. I already inked them up, whatever. I'll just write with them real quick so I can show you what they look like. And I kind of inked them up to color match the pens. These are all Retropop Pilot Metropolitans. So this is a medium nib. And I don't know how much you're really going to be able to see it exactly. How much you're going to say exactly? Okay. Pilot. We might have to speed this up. I don't know. Izuku, and this is Toe Row. So you see what I mean? Like if you're writing with this, is this bright enough? I think it stands out enough against the paper to be usable. You could definitely go with something darker, something a little more orange, but all around decent. So that one's kind of cool. Let's take a look at Shungyo. This is a fine nib. So this is going to be a thinner nib, but you're going to see it better because the ink itself is a lot darker. Ugh, getting sloppy. There you go. So even in a fine nib like this, it really stands out. This is a very, very readable ink. I like that a lot. And last but not least, let's go with Rika. This is going to be in fine nib as well. Probably not the best nib to show it off, but what the heck. Pilot. Iroshizuku. There you go. No extreme properties on these, nothing crazy. I didn't like do writing tests with dry time or anything like that, but I think if you have any experience with Iroshizuku inks, you can expect it's going to perform like most other Iroshizukus. Dry time seems to be pretty decent. The flow seems in that middle 80%, like I just talked about earlier. It's pretty middle of the road. Nothing super wet, nothing super dry. They all feel, granted, I tested different nib sizes, but they all feel fairly similar in terms of flow, maybe slightly leaning on the dry side, if I had to say. But yeah, overall feels pretty good. Ink flows well, reads back great. Honestly, as a group, they're kind of a nice looking collection. So there you go. 3 new Pilot Iroshizuku colors. Now you've seen them. So that's like the business portion of the segment here. Honestly, I've recorded a lot longer than I expected, so I'm not going to hang around in Brian's adventure time too long. Part of it is like the adventures that I've had have really been all holiday related, lots of gift related things. I'm just busy. Kids, family, coworkers. It's just a lot of everybody. So in the downtime, still playing all my instruments, really, and just enjoying playing music so much. But Stardew Valley, still going hard at it. Rachel's super into it. And now my son also very into it. So we're kind of all 3 playing it at the same time now, which is really crazy because I'm not the like RPG farming simulator kind of guy. This is like really the first game like that I've really played. Just something about this game just grabbed the hold of me, and it's been fun. It's been nice to just do something in my downtime. And I've watched Rachel and Joseph get really into like Zelda Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, a few other things. Rachel and Ellie both really got into Animal Crossing. You know, they get deep into these games, and I'm normally like, you know, give me a good car racing game, or what else have I typically played? Yeah, like the one I've talked about before, you know, Snow Runner, where it's like, let me drive trucks and deliver logs to a lumber yard, you know. Not typically like super, super deep, you know, knowledge games, but I don't know, something about this one just kind of got me. So I'm not going to go on and on and on about it, even though I could. But if you want to comment about the Stardew Valley stuff, I could probably nerd out with you pretty hard at this point. I just completed my year 5, and I just forged my Infinity Blade. For any of you that know what that is, you'll know that that's an accomplishment. But for those of you that don't care, I'm going to move on. Yeah, just lots of stuff. I have both my kids' birthdays generally around this Christmas time, holiday time. So that's a thing when it comes time to Rachel and I getting gifts, wrapping gifts, sorting them all out. Spreadsheets get involved because it just gets to be so much. We have not only like business contacts and people that we work with, we have, you know, coworkers and other various things. We have family. I also have extended family that has birthdays around this time of year as well, and Christmas and all these things. It just gets to be kind of a lot. My kids, both their birthdays. So this is like our busiest time for the company. So this ends up just being kind of a bananas time of year. So been very busy, and I haven't gotten into like, you know, any log adventures or anything like that. Because basically I'm just like working pretty hard all the time. But anyway, having a good time, lots of gift times. Yeah, that's basically all I have. I'm going to be spending the next couple of weeks doing lots of family things. So also still working a little bit, but yeah, that's pretty much the updates that I have for my adventures right now. We'll go ahead and wrap this up, and I got a fun fact for you at the end. All right, I want to thank you for watching. Please leave me some feedback. I'm going to be going back to this video a couple weeks from now to pull for, you know, questions for future episodes. Please ask away. Give me as many questions as you want. There's no such thing as a bad question. There's just questions that I won't answer. So ask away, because the more options I have, the better Q&As that I can make. So please think about that. Post comments on the video, and I would love to answer them. Check out gouletpens.com. You probably are all shopped out at this point, and basically you're past practical shipping deadlines anyway by the time this video goes out. But that's okay. There's It's not all about the holidays. There's going to be other things that come out anyway, and you probably need a refill on ink at some point, and maybe you want some new ink that just came out. Who knows? So you can go check those out. We're going to keep videos going through the end of the year, and then, we'll start over in 2025. It's crazy. Can you believe 2024 is almost over? I feel like it was just summer, like school just started. Didn't it? Right? No, it's like winter break now. It's crazy. All right. Let's end this thing on a fun fact. So it's holiday times. There's lots of decorations and stuff. I'll be honest with you, decorations totally just off my radar. Normally I would like decorate my office a little bit and do stuff around the house. We got our tree up. I'm considering that a win. Basically everything else I kind of bailed because we've been that busy. But did get me thinking though, like I know there's some people with some pretty crazy light displays, stuff like that, especially now with like computers and you can set stuff to music and all that. I'm like, there's got to be some like bonkers displays out there. So I was like, what the heck? Let's see, what is the record for most number of lights at somebody's house, like a residential Christmas light display. And turns out there is a Guinness World Record for most lights on a residential, Christmas display. It belongs to Timothy and Grace Gay of Union Vale, New York. They set the record in 2014 and have kept it and have raised the bar ever since with now over 720,000 lights, which is such a big number. I can't even conceive of what that even really is. It takes them about 3 months to set up the 40 miles of lights that they have and 8 miles of extension cords. That's crazy. They have it set to music with a central computer in their house linked to 108 wireless light controllers that they use for this whole display. They said that between 50 and 100,000 people come to see their house at Christmas time in their 4,500 person town. Basically, it just overruns the town. But over the last 3 decades, because of this and because of people, donating and stuff like that, they have donated over $665,000 to children's charities of a variety of natures. So I don't know. I just thought that was kind of cool. I don't know them personally, obviously at all, but there's lots of news reports and videos and stuff you can look up. It's kind of interesting. So I just thought that was a little fun fact for you. And then the holidays will be over by the time I come back and we'll have new things to talk about. But hope you all have a safe and very happy holidays. Hope you are thinking hard about your resolutions for New Year's. I don't have any in particular myself, but I'll think of something. If I come up with any, I'll mention it in the next Q&A. How about that? If you have any recommendations for ones or ones you want to do, maybe leave in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much. I enjoyed doing this. It's been a good year. And I will see you in 2025. Right on.